In the heart of the land, beneath the watchful gaze of ancient baobab trees, lay the village of Kala. Untouched by time, it was a place where the very air seemed to hum with an old, hidden magic. The people lived by the old laws, once passed down from ancestors. And the most sacred of these laws was the silence of the women. Their beauty was said to be a gift from the gods, but it came with a price. Their voices were to remain silent, for words held the power to destroy the balance of the world. Despite the reverence given to the silent women, there were whispers of discontent. Beneath the surface, the women began to feel the weight of their silence, the crushing burden of a beauty locked away by a curse. Some longed to speak, to break free from the invisible chains that bound them, but none dared, for the legends spoke of what happened to those who spoke too soon. And yet, in the deep corners of their hearts, a quiet rebellion began to stir. One day, as the winds whispered the songs of forgotten gods, a stranger came to Kala. His name was Mapu, a man whose features were chiseled by the harsh winds of a distant land. He had heard tales of the village, tales of the women whose beauty had enchanted the world. He came not to worship, but to claim what he believed was his due. When Mapu first spoke to the elders, his voice seemed to slice through the air, like a blade. "I have heard of your women," he said, his words deep and deliberate. "Their beauty is unmatched, and I have come to see it with my own eyes. I will not leave until I have spoken to one of them." The elders, old and wise, looked upon him with suspicion. They had heard of outsiders who came seeking the women's beauty, but they had never seen one with such confidence, such audacity. The air grew thick with unease. "You do not understand." Nimba, the eldest of the elders, spoke softly but firmly. "Their beauty is a gift, but one bound by silence. To break that silence is to unleash chaos." But Mapu's eyes glinted with a strange fire, and he smiled knowingly. "I seek only to understand. I believe that a beauty which cannot be spoken is wasted. I will free them." The following days passed. In an easy silence, Mapu stayed in the village, observing the women with a hunger in his eyes. He spoke to them, his words soft and coaxing, yet they never responded. The women, their faces cold and distant, seemed to regard him as an outsider, a foreigner whose presence could not be understood. But still, the silence in the village began to change. As the days stretched on, Mapu's influence began to seep into the hearts of the women. He would visit them in their homes, speaking gently of freedom and release. Slowly, the silence began to crack. Amina, the youngest and most beautiful of the women, began to notice him. She had long felt the weight of her silence, the quiet suffocation of her thoughts and desires. She would watch him from a distance, her heart beating faster with every word he spoke. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in blood-red hues, Amina stood alone beneath the great baobab tree. Her heart raced as she felt the weight of her ancestors' warnings pressing against her chest. Yet, the temptation was too strong. With trembling lips, she parted her mouth and whispered, "I am free." The moment Amina spoke, the earth trembled beneath their feet. The winds howled through the village, a violent, chaotic sound. From the forest, from the very depths of the earth, a terrible presence began to awaken. The Nzamba, the ancient spirits who had protected the village, stirred with fury. Their voices, once a soft murmur, now roared like 1,000 storms. The other women gathered around Amina, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. They too had felt the stirring, the strange pull in their hearts. And then, one by one, they began to speak, their voices trembling, as they broke the silence that had held them captive for generations. Each word they spoke felt like a crack in the very foundation of the world. And as the words filled the air, the ground began to crack and split. Mapu, who had once come to claim the women's beauty, now found himself ensnared by the forces he had disturbed. The Nzamba, furious with the breaking of the ancient pact, emerged from the earth like serpents, made of shadows, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. They moved with terrifying speed, their forms swirling like smoke and mist. The village, once peaceful and serene, was now a battleground. The silence that had once protected it had been shattered, and in its place came madness. The women, their faces wild with the power of their newfound voices, began to move in strange and erratic patterns. Then Zamba clawed at the sky, their voices a chorus of rage, but the women's voices rose higher, filling the air with an unnatural cacophony. Mapu tried to flee, but the land itself seemed to turn against him. The trees bent towards him, their roots twisting and pulling him into the earth. The sky grew dark, as though night had descended in an instant. He screamed, but no one could hear him. The village of Kala was no more. It had become a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had been blurred. The women, freed from their silence, were now bound to something darker. The spirits that had once protected them now claimed them as their own. Their beauty was no longer just a gift. It had become a curse. As for Mapu, no one knew what became of him. Some say he was consumed by the trees. Others said he was consumed by the earth, or he was consumed by the spirit itself. Zamba,